Chapter 4 of In Kent with Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. In Kent with Charles Dickens by Thomas Frost. Chapter 4. When the Pickwickians had their headquarters at the Bull Inn, High Street, Rochester, their immortal leader entered in his diary a few brief remarks upon Strood, Rochester, and Chatham, which evince his close observation of everything which came under his notice in the course of his travels. The principal productions of these towns, he wrote, appear to be soldiers, sailors, Jews, chalk, shrimps, officers, and dockyard men. The commodities chiefly exposed for sale in the public streets are marine stores, hardbake, apples, flatfish, and oysters. These characteristics are especially observable in walking through the streets of Chatham, of which we did considerable on that September afternoon and evening in our search for localities associated with the early years of Dickens; and Mr. Pickwick might have added to them that the most numerous shops in all parts of that town are gin shops, beer shops, rag shops, and second-hand furniture shops. In one street which we traversed, every third house was devoted to the sale of intoxicating liquors, and we had no difficulty in finding the shop where poor little David Copperfield sold his jacket on the morning after he trudged weary and footsore into Chatham, which in that night's aspect was a mere dream of chalk and drawbridges, and mastless ships in a muddy river roofed like Noah's arks, and slept upon a sort of grass-grown battery overhanging a lane, where a sentry was walking to and fro. Our first inquiries were directed to the discovery of St. Mary's Place, otherwise the Brook, by which name the place is now generally known and designated. Here, in a small plaster-fronted, unpretentious-looking house, with a small garden before it, Dickens passed 5 years of his childhood, his parents exchanging Chatham for the metropolis when he was in his 10th year, when, as Mr. Forster says, the Kentish woods and fields, Cobham Park and Hall, Rochester Cathedral and Castle, and all their wonderful romance, including the red-cheeked baby he had been wildly in love with, were to vanish like a dream. But only for a time. The world knows now how fondly he cherished the memory of the scenes amid which his early years were passed, how often he visited them in after life, and how in his manhood's prime he returned to end his days among them, becoming a Kentish freeholder on what he had learned to regard as his native heath. From the Brook we strolled to Rome Lane, a portion of which still remains, but the house in which the future novelist and his sister Fanny attended a preparatory school had disappeared, having long before been pulled down for standing in the way of the Chatham and Dover Railway. Clover Lane, now improved into Clover Street, was the next place visited; but there also the demolisher had been at work, and the playground of Dickens' second school, to which he was transferred in his 8th year, had become a portion of the site of Chatham Station. This was the school kept in those days by the Reverend William Giles, minister of the Baptist Chapel in St. Mary's Place, of whom Dickens retained a not ungrateful sense in after years that this first of his masters, in his little cared-for childhood, had pronounced him to be a boy of capacity. And when, about half-way through the publication of Pickwick, his old teacher sent him a silver snuff-box, with an admiring inscription to "the inimitable Boz," it reminded him of praise far more precious obtained by him at his first year's examination in the Clover Lane Academy, when his recitation of a piece out of the Humourist's Miscellany about Dr. Bolus had received, unless his youthful vanity bewildered him, a double encore. Footnote from Forster's Life of Charles Dickens. End of footnote. In Chatham he found the originals of several of the characters who live deathlessly in his novels. the half-starved little drudge of the Bevis Marks household, whom Dick Swiveller, in the grandiloquent style proper to the perpetual chairman of the Glorious Apollos, calls the Marchioness, was suggested by a girl who was taken from Chatham workhouse when the Dickens family removed to London, to perform the menial service of their new home. Gaffer Hexam, who plies the ghastly trade of fishing corpses out of the Thames, and his son, the selfish brother of the loving and brave Lizzie Hexam (where did Dickens find her, I wonder?), had their originals in a dockyard labourer and his son, whom Dickens mentions, in a letter which has been given to the world by Mr. Forster, as the uneducated father in fustian, and the educated boy in spectacles, whom Leach and I saw in Chatham. Our search for brick and mortar mementoes of the novelist's early years having been attended with some amount of disappointment, and there being yet some available daylight, we found our way to the river, and strolled along its marshy banks in the direction of Brompton. There, as we turned towards the broad stream, which makes a very acute angle at the extreme point of our view southward, we saw the towers of Rochester Castle and Cathedral change from red to grey in the fading twilight, and, looking northward, the extensive marshes between the estuaries of the Medway and the Thames growing more dim and indistinct as we gazed. On such a spot as that whereon we stood was washed ashore, one day towards the close of the 13th century, the corpse of that drowned mariner whose finding and burial formed the first link in the remarkable chain of sensational incidents comprised in the legendary story of Sir Robert Shurland and his horse. According to the version of the legend which I followed, in repeating it to my companions as we strolled towards our quarters, the drowned sailor was cast ashore at Chatham, and interred in the burial ground of a little church dedicated to St. Bridget, of which, however, no trace can be found at the present day. Its red bricks and Kentish ragstone cannot, therefore, be pointed out as mute evidences of the verity of the story, as Gaffer Hexam pointed to the Jolly Fellowship porters as proof of his statement that Rogue Riderhood had confessed to him that he had murdered John Harmon. It would seem at first sight that there could have been no connection, by way of cause and effect, between the burial of a drowned mariner at Chatham and the death of the Knight of Shurland in the Isle of Sheppey some years afterwards. But according to the legend, St. Bridget, resenting the interment of the corpse in the burial ground of a church dedicated to her saintship, on the ground of the sailor having died without receiving priestly absolution from his sins, appeared to the clerk and commanded him to disinter it and throw it into the river. The saintly order was obeyed, and the ghastly and unwholesome subject drifted down the river with the tide. For several days the horrible thing was carried backward and forward, every flood and ebb, between Sheerness and Gillingham Reach, but at length a strong breeze from the north-west wafted it round the point, and caused it to be washed ashore near the village of Minster, on the foreshore of the extensive domain of Sir Robert Shurland. On the unwholesome presence of the grim waif becoming known to the knight, he gave directions for its burial in the parish churchyard, but the story of its rejection by St. Biddy had reached Minster, and the priest refused compliance with the knight's order. Sir Robert insisted, ordered a couple of his serfs to dig a grave in the churchyard and lower the corpse into it, and went himself to see that the order was obeyed. The grave and the corpse were there, but not the priest. Irritated by his absence, for knights were not accustomed in those days to have their orders disobeyed, whether lawful or not, he sent for the priest, who presently stood beside the grave. "Now do thine office," said the knight, with an ominous frown, "or, by the holy rood—" He said no more, but completed the sentence with a gesture which left no doubt as to what the priest might expect if he continued obdurate. he again refused to offer a single prayer, and the knight, becoming purple with passion, lifted his right foot and bestowed upon him a kick that precipitated him headlong into the grave. According to one version of the story, his neck was broken by the fall; another has it that he was buried alive. Be this as it may, the grave was hastily filled up, and Sir Robert Shurland returned to his castle. Why St. Bridget should have troubled her saintly head further about the matter is not very clear. Perhaps she felt that the interment of the corpse at Minster was a reflection upon herself, but feminine reasons lie too deep for discovery. The legend tells us only what her saintship did, namely that she complained to St. Augustine, who presented her grievance before the abbot of his monastery at Canterbury, the still existing magnificent gateway of which closes the vista of St. Paul's Street. Then the abbot called upon the Sheriff of Kent to set the law in motion against the sacrilegious Knight of Shurland, and the sheriff summoned the posse comitatus, and presenting himself before the gates of Shurland Castle, commanded Sir Robert to surrender and be hanged. The knight ordered the drawbridge to be raised and the portcullis to be dropped, and bade the sheriff go and be hanged himself. The representative of the law made a futile effort to vindicate its outraged majesty, but hammering at the gate had no other effect than to irritate the lord of the castle, who at length, finding that the noise disturbed his afternoon nap, sallied out at the head of a dozen of his retainers, and laid about him with such hearty goodwill with his two-handed sword, that the sheriff and his followers soon took to flight, and left him to the enjoyment of his siesta. Some time afterwards, having learned that the abbot of St. Augustine's had written to the Pope, Boniface VIII., and that the papal legate in London had demanded that justice should be done upon the sacrilegious Knight of Shurland, threatening excommunication in default, Sir Robert seems to have become uneasy in his mind as to the possible consequences. The appearance of the royal barge off the coast with the king on board brought the matter to a crisis. The knight mounted his horse and rode down to the beach, where, instead of dismounting and calling for a boat, he rode into the sea and forced his horse to swim to the royal barge, which is said to have been anchored 2 miles from the shore. Perhaps he thought that the feat would win him the favour of the king. Perhaps it was only the freak of a man addicted to exploits of an uncommon character. What he urged in palliation of his offences is not told, but he received the royal pardon, and returned to the shore in the same manner as he had reached the ship. Then, as one version of the legend runs, he heard the croaking voice of an old woman, who gave utterance to a prophecy that his horse would some day be the cause of his death. But another version has it that, as he rode up the beach, he heard mutterings that such an exploit could only have been performed by the aid of the Evil One, who was supposed to have taken possession of the horse. Whatever he was moved by, the knight sprang from the saddle, drew his sword, and at one blow struck off the gallant steed's head. The date of this occurrence and the circumstances of the knight's death are variously stated. As Philipot says, Sir Robert's tomb in Minster Church has become the scene of much falsehood and popular error, the vulgar having digged out of his vault many wild legends and romances. According to one account, the remarkable feat of equine natation was performed when Edward I. was preparing for the invasion of Scotland, and it was on Sir Robert Shurland's return from the war that, landing on the beach with the remnant of his retainers, and coming upon the bleaching skeleton of the slain horse, he gave the skull a contemptuous kick, and in so doing wounded his foot with one of the bones. The inflammation of the wound produced mortification of the injured member, and the knight died. But according to another version of the story, it was the French war for which preparations were then being made, and the knight's death was caused by his horse, while bearing him in the chase, stumbling at the spot where the skeleton of the horse lay, and throwing the rider from the saddle upon the skull, from which he thus received the fatal injury. How much of this story is truth, and how much fiction, it would now be very difficult to determine. Sir Robert Shurland was knighted by Edward I. for his gallant conduct at the siege of Caerlaverock Castle. His name survives in Shurland House, a mansion near Eastchurch, on the right of the lane leading from Minster to Warden. His tomb is shown in Minster Church, and there can be no doubt that the horse's head sculptured above the recumbent figure of the warrior, and which also figures in the vane which surmounts the spire of the church, commemorates some memorable circumstance of his life. But we may be permitted to be sceptical concerning those portions of the story in which St. Bridget and St. Augustine figure. Footnote: another brave Kentish soldier was knighted for like services at the same time, namely Sir John Hadlow, who derived his name from the village now called Hadlow, near Tunbridge, and whose castle and estate at that place afterwards passed into the possession of a family named Fane. End of footnote. Those who would see the remarkable monument, which either commemorates some such feat as tradition affirms to have been performed by Sir Robert Shurland, or, as Philipot suggests, has been the foundation upon which the legend has been built up, will find, in an excursion to Minster, much to interest them, irrespective of that which attaches to the knight's tomb. Minster may be reached either from Queenborough or Sheerness by a walk of less than 3/4 of an hour, or by a walk of about 2 hours and a half from Rainham, at which place there is a station on the railway from Chatham to Dover. Though it was not on the occasion of the Dickens pilgrimage that I explored some of the most interesting portions of the Isle of Sheppey, the reader will probably not object to accompany me in a ramble from the spot where the corpse of the drowned mariner was first washed ashore, to the churchyard where it ultimately found burial, and the ancient church which contains the tomb of Sir Robert Shurland. Opposite Rainham Church there is a lane, which, passing under the railway, follows the indentations of the creeks and marshes on the right bank of the Medway. This amphibious tract extends from Gillingham to the Swale, and is intersected by numerous creeks and channels of the estuary, which, including the low islands, is more than twice as wide here as it is where the batteries of Sheerness command its mouth. Between two of these creeks, and about 1.5 miles from Rainham, is the village of Upchurch, famous for its deposits of Roman pottery, and the ancient cemetery, on the ridge behind the marsh, to the east of Otterham Creek, in which the potters and their families were interred. These deposits extend about 3 miles along the marshy banks of the river, and it seems, from their extent and nature, that the field of operations was changed as the clay became exhausted, and that the broken pottery was left in heaps on the ground. After the abandonment of the works, the fields gradually became covered with alluvial soil deposited by the tide, which afterwards scooped channels and creeks in it. The deposits of pottery consist chiefly of fragments, but now and then a tolerably perfect specimen rewards the search, which, however, had better be left to the natives, as there is little chance of a find without wading knee-deep in the mud, and exploring the banks below the water with a stick or a rake. The pottery is of firm and hard texture, and usually blue-black in colour, but articles of red ware, ornamented with lines and raised dots in a variety of patterns, have occasionally been found. Traces of the buildings occupied by the potters have been found in Halstow Marsh, especially near the church of Lower Halstow, which the rambler comes upon soon after leaving the little village of Upchurch. An embankment, which has here been raised against the encroachments of the tide, abounds in fragments of Roman tiles and pottery, and many of these tiles have been worked into the lower portion of the walls of the little church, which stands upon a mound on the borders of the marsh. Beyond this place the road skirts the marsh for a short distance, and then runs by the side of the narrow channel which divides it from Chitney Island until we approach the King's Ferry. Though the scenery of this part of Kent does not present much variety of surface, or abound with the objects which constitute the beauty of an English landscape at a greater distance from the sea, it has a charm, I will venture to say a picturesqueness, peculiar to itself. The vegetation of the marshes, the birds that wing their flight over them, are of species distinct from those of inland districts, and the alternations of land and water presented by the marshes, the low green islands, and the channels between them, make a picture as different from the wooded hills far away to the right, as the aquatic plants and the soberly plumaged birds of the shore and the sea are from the shrubs and plants and bright-winged warblers of the woods, or as the murmuring of the tide as it washes against the clayey banks and gurgles among the reeds and sedges, and the cries of the gulls and terns are from the song of birds and the hum of insects in the woods and the green lanes. But different as are the scenes and sounds of these marshes to those of an inland district, they have their peculiar charm for the rambler, if he be, as he ought to be, a lover of nature. The Swale was formerly the ordinary passage for vessels sailing between the Thames or Medway and ports to the southward, and as it is still deep enough for vessels of 200 tons, its disuse may be attributed to the increased size of the ships of the present day, rather than to any diminution of the depth of water. It is now used only by barges and small coasting vessels, and the ferry has been superseded by the railway viaduct, which has been so constructed as to serve also for an ordinary carriage road and footpath, while a drawbridge in the centre enables masted vessels to pass under it. The church of Iwade is seen on the right as we approach the Swale, and as we cross the viaduct the distant mound of Tong Castle may be discerned in the same direction. The low shore of Sheppey reached, the rambler proceeds in a north-easterly direction, parallel to the railway for a short distance, but on the right of it, and gradually diverging from it. A lane leading to the village of Minster turns to the right, where the road to dull Queenborough and dirty Sheerness bears to the left. And as our sense of smell begins to take cognizance of the saline odour of the North Sea, we enter the village and look about us for the remains of the old monastery. Of Shurland Castle no trace can now be found, but of the abbey there remain the gatehouse and the church, under the south entrance of which the distinguishing characteristics of a Norman arch are discoverable. Entering the church, we find the tomb of Sir Robert Shurland beneath a pointed arch on the south side of the chancel, with the sculptured figure of a knight, represented in the chain mail of the 13th century, reclining upon it, with the hands clasped on the breast, the legs crossed, showing that he had fought against the Moslems, and his shield and banner beneath him. The sculptured head of a horse, do not forget to look for this, projects from the wall at the back of the recess in which the tomb stands, just above the recumbent figure of the knight, and it will be observed that it seems to be emerging from stony waves, as if in the act of swimming. Philipott thinks it probable that the horse's head was added to the monument because the manor of Shurland had attached to it, among other privileges, a grant of the wrecks on the coast of Sheppey within its limits, which grant was esteemed to reach as far into the water as at low tide a man can ride in and touch anything with the point of a lance. But this explanation is somewhat far-fetched, and though incredulity as to the knight's ride through the waves may be natural, neither of the generally received versions of the story, the supernatural features excepted, are, in other respects, unfeasible. Leaving the village of Minster, we proceed towards the beach, from which the brown alluvial cliffs rise to a height varying from 80 to 100 feet. Under the combined operations of the waves, the brickmakers, and the searchers for the fossils and the nodules of pyrites embedded in the clay, they are rapidly diminishing, and, though time has shown great exaggeration in the estimate of Sir Charles Lyell, in 1834, that, calculating by the rate of destruction during the previous 20 years, the whole of the island would be washed over by the tide in another half century, the face of the cliff has receded considerably to the south. On the occasion of my visit to this part of the coast, I had scarcely set my foot on the beach when the roughness, exceeding even that of the shingle of Dover and Deal, drew my attention from the pea-green sea to the stones at my feet, and the remarkable appearance of one of them prompted me to pick it up. It was the petrified fruit of an extinct palm, similar to several species now abundant in the tropical regions of the Far East. Another and another arrested my gaze as I walked on. I could not step without setting my foot on some water-worn remnant of the organic life of a former period, which the waves had washed out of the cliff. As the beach of this portion of the island is a favourite hunting ground of geologists, and is, besides, under a constant process of exploration by a rather numerous tribe of local collectors, who gather fossils for sale to the curious in such things, it is only by exceptional good fortune that the rambler can pick up a prime specimen among the wave-worn pebbles. Fossil fruits, fragments of the carapaces of tortoises and turtles, vertebrae of crocodiles and serpents, teeth of large sharks, may be discovered, but if rarer relics of the antediluvian world are desired, and cannot be found upon the beach, recourse must be had to the aforesaid collectors, most of whom live in the cottages about Scapsgate, in the lane leading from Minster to the Royal Oak, near Hensbrook, and at Warden Point. From these men may be obtained at moderate prices bones of an extinct vulture, carapaces and plastrons of the tortoise, and skulls of an extinct species of fish. My ramble under the brown cliffs of this rich fossil-yielding shore was made at low water, and the inexperienced explorer will do well to ascertain the state of the tide before setting out, or he may be caught by it and shut in between two projecting points, with the rising sea on one side of him and the crumbling and precipitous cliff on the other. It has been my fortune to be twice caught in this manner on the Kentish coast, one of which adventures will be told in another chapter. The little hamlet of Hensbrook is situated above a picturesque opening in the cliffs between Minster and Warden. The ramble between these villages may be made either along the beach, the state of the tide permitting, or by the road, the distance being about the same. Warden is situated just above the little promontory named after it, and in the midst of evidences of the continual encroachment of the sea upon the land. 20 years ago, an extensive landslip carried away a large portion of the churchyard, and the east end of the church is now on the verge of the cliff, and the entire edifice is threatened with destruction. Beyond Warden Point the coast trends to the south-east, and the cliffs gradually become lower, and at length sink to the low and marshy shore bordering the Mussel Bank. The rambler is advised, therefore, if he has reached the point by the beach, to return by the road, or, in the alternative case, and if he does not wish to return to Sheerness or Queenborough, to turn from the road at the lane which skirts the western side of Shurland Park, and return to the viaduct over the Swale by the by-road which crosses Bramble Down. End of Chapter 4.